In the summer of 1943, when most young women were working in factories or volunteering for the Red Cross, Sarah Mitchell was doing something that would have been impossible just months earlier. She was falling through the sky at 120 miles per hour with nothing but fabric and rope between her and certain death. But this wasn't her first jump, or her 10th, or even her 50th. This was jump number 847, and she had learned something that would change military history forever. What Sarah discovered that day, as she watched her fellow soldiers struggle with their parachutes in the chaos of a practice mission, would revolutionize how armies around the world thought about elite forces. It would also cost her everything she had worked for, everything she believed in, and nearly her life. But sometimes the most important discoveries come from the people nobody wants to listen to. Sometimes the greatest innovations come from those who are told they don't belong. And sometimes being thrown out is exactly what it takes to find a better way. This is the true story of how a woman who was rejected by the very institution she helped create would go on to prove that the most elite soldiers in the world don't actually need the one thing everyone thought they couldn't live without. This is the story of how Sarah Mitchell discovered that Rangers don't rely on parachutes. They rely on something far more powerful. Sarah Mitchell had always been different, but it wasn't until she stood in the recruitment office in downtown Chicago that she realized just how different the world expected her to be. The year was 1941, and America had just entered World War II. Young men were lining up around the block to enlist, their faces eager and determined. Sarah stood among them, her application clutched in her hand, watching as one by one they were welcomed into the ranks of the military. When her turn came, the recruiting sergeant looked at her application and then at her face, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to confusion, then to something that looked almost like amusement. "Miss, I think you're in the wrong line," he said, his voice carrying the kind of patronizing tone that Sarah had heard her entire life. The Women's Auxiliary Corps has their own office down the street. But Sarah wasn't interested in typing letters or serving coffee to officers. She had grown up on a farm in rural Illinois, where being strong wasn't optional and being tough wasn't considered unladylike. It was considered survival. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 8 years old, not because he thought she might need to defend herself, but because every person on the farm had responsibilities, and keeping the wolves away from the livestock was one of them. She had spent her teenage years climbing trees to fix broken power lines during storms, wrestling cattle that outweighed her by hundreds of pounds, and carrying feed bags that most men would struggle with. When other girls her age were learning to dance and flirt, Sarah was learning to read weather patterns and track wounded animals through dense forest. She could navigate by the stars, start a fire in the rain, and had once walked 15 miles through a blizzard to get help when her father had broken his leg. The recruiting sergeant didn't know any of this, of course. All he saw was a young woman with short brown hair and calloused hands, wearing a simple dress that she had sewn herself. He couldn't have known that underneath that dress were muscles earned through years of hard labor, or that behind her quiet demeanor was a determination that had been forged in the kind of hardship that most people never experience. "I want to serve in combat," Sarah told him simply. "I want to be where the fighting is." The sergeant's amusement turned to irritation. "Miss, women don't serve in combat. It's not natural. You want to help the war effort. There are plenty of ways to do that without putting yourself in danger." But Sarah had been hearing about the war in Europe for years, long before America got involved. She had read about the women in the Soviet Union who were fighting alongside men, flying bomber missions, and serving as snipers. She had heard about the resistance fighters in France and Norway, women who were risking everything to fight against fascism. The idea that American women were somehow less capable than their European counterparts seemed absurd to her. "I can outshoot most men," she said. "I can outrun them too. I can carry my own weight, and then some. What exactly makes me less qualified than someone who's never held a gun or spent a night outdoors?" The sergeant was getting uncomfortable now. Other people in line were starting to listen, and he clearly wanted this conversation to end. "Miss, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but the military has its regulations for good reasons. Women in combat would be a distraction to the men. They'd be worried about protecting you instead of focusing on their mission. Sarah felt something hot rise in her chest. The same feeling she'd had when the bank manager had told her father that women couldn't co-sign loans, or when the county extension agent had suggested that maybe farming wasn't really a woman's place. It was the feeling of being dismissed, not because of anything she had done or failed to do, but simply because of what she was. "What if I could prove I'm as good as any man you've enlisted?" she asked. The sergeant sighed. "Miss, please. You're holding up the line." That's when Sarah noticed that the line had gone quiet. The young men behind her were listening, and she could see in their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Most of them looked like they had come straight from high school or college, with soft hands and uncertain expressions. They were eager to serve their country. She could see that, but many of them also looked like they had never faced real hardship. One of them, a tall boy with sandy hair and freckles, stepped forward. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to see that. If she's claiming she can outshoot and outrun us, maybe she should prove it." The sergeant looked like he wanted to disappear. "This is highly irregular." "Come on, Sarge," said another recruit, this one older and more confident. "What's the harm? If she fails, she'll see why the military is the way it is. If she doesn't." He shrugged. "Well, then, maybe we learned something." Sarah could see the sergeant calculating the situation. He was clearly hoping she would back down, but she could also see that the recruits were now genuinely interested in what would happen. Backing down now would make him look weak, but agreeing to her challenge could cause problems he didn't want to deal with. "Fine," he said finally, "but this is not an official test. This is just to satisfy everyone's curiosity. There's a shooting range in the basement and a track behind the building. But when you fail these tests, you agree to stop wasting my time and go to the women's corps where you belong." Sarah nodded. "And if I don't fail?" The sergeant's expression made it clear that he didn't believe failure was a possibility worth considering. "If you somehow manage to outperform these men, then I'll personally escort you to speak with my commanding officer about your options." The shooting test came first. The basement range was small and poorly lit, with targets set at 50 yards. Standard military rifles were provided, weapons that Sarah had never fired before, but that shared enough characteristics with her father's hunting rifles that she felt confident. The test was simple: 10 shots as standard target, scored for accuracy. The first recruit, the sandy-haired boy who had challenged her, went first. His shots were respectable, clustering around the target with 7 hits in the scoring rings. The others performed similarly, with scores ranging from decent to poor. Most of them had clearly never fired a rifle before enlisting, and their inexperience showed. When Sarah's turn came, she took her time examining the rifle, checking the sight alignment, and testing the trigger pull. The weapon felt heavier than what she was used to, but the basic mechanics were familiar. She settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing the way her father had taught her, and began to fire. Her first shot hit the center ring. So did her second, and her third. By the time she fired her 10th shot, there was complete silence in the room. All 10 of her shots had hit the center ring, clustered so tightly that they could have been covered by a silver dollar. "Lucky," muttered one of the recruits, but his voice lacked conviction. The running test took place on a quarter-mile track behind a building. The standard was to complete 4 laps in under 7 minutes, which was considered a respectable time for military recruits. Most of the young men managed it with effort, huffing and puffing, but crossing the finish line within the required time. Sarah had been running since she was old enough to walk. On the farm, you ran to chase down escaped animals, to get help in emergencies, to beat the weather when storms were coming. She had run miles through mud and snow, up hills, and across rough terrain, often while carrying something heavy. A flat track felt almost too easy. She finished the mile run in 5 minutes and 40 seconds, barely breathing hard, and could have kept going. More than that, it was clear to everyone watching that she could have kept going for a long time. The sergeant stared at her time, written on his stopwatch, as if the numbers might change if he looked at them long enough. The recruits were quiet, some of them looking embarrassed, others seeming genuinely impressed. "This doesn't change anything," The sergeant said finally. "These are just basic tests. Real combat is different. Real combat is—" He struggled for the words. "It's not about individual skills. It's about being part of a unit. It's about trust and brotherhood and things that you just wouldn't understand." But Sarah could see in his face that something had changed. She had proven something that he hadn't expected to be proven, and now he was going to have to deal with the consequences. "You promised me a meeting with your commanding officer," Sarah said quietly. The sergeant looked like a man who was realizing he had made a mistake he couldn't take back. "I'll make some calls," he said reluctantly. "But don't get your hopes up. Even if my CO agrees to see you, there are regulations that go way above his head. There are laws about women in combat that weren't written to be changed by one person, no matter how good she might be at running and shooting." But Sarah had gotten what she wanted, a foot in the door. She knew that once she got in front of someone with real authority, she could make her case. She had spent her whole life proving that she could do things people said she couldn't do. This would just be one more thing. What she didn't know was that the conversation she was about to have would set in motion a series of events that would take her into the most dangerous and secretive parts of the military, teach her skills that few people in the world possessed, and ultimately lead to her discovering something about elite warfare that would change how armies around the world thought about their most dangerous missions. She also didn't know that the same determination and independence that was getting her this opportunity would eventually make her enemies among the very people she was trying to serve alongside, and that those enemies would do everything in their power to destroy not just her military career, but her life. The meeting with the commanding officer was scheduled for the following week. Sarah went home to the farm to wait, helping her mother with the harvest, and try not to think too much about what might happen. She had taken the first step towards something that might be impossible, but she had learned a long time ago that impossible things were often just difficult things that nobody had figured out how to do yet. Her father found her that evening, sitting on the porch and staring at the horizon. "You know," he said, settling into the chair next to her, "your mother and I always knew you were going to do something extraordinary. We just never knew what it would be." Sarah looked at him, this man who had taught her everything about being strong and independent, who had never once told her that there were things she couldn't do because she was a woman. "What if I'm wrong?" she asked. "What if they're right and I don't belong in combat?" Her father was quiet for a long moment. "You know what I learned from 40 years of farming?" he said finally. "The land doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. A storm doesn't care. A sick animal doesn't care. What matters is whether you can do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. Everything else is just people making excuses for why they don't want to find out what you're really capable of." A week later, Sarah Mitchell walked into a military office wearing her best dress and carrying a folder full of recommendations from people who had known her all her life. She was about to begin a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about herself, about loyalty, about what it meant to serve something bigger than yourself. She was about to discover that the military was full of people who were just as determined as she was, but not all of them were determined to do the right thing. Colonel James Morrison had been in the Army for 22 years, and he thought he had seen everything. He had served in the trenches of World War I, survived the influenza pandemic, and helped train the first generation of soldiers who would fight in this new war. He was a practical man who believed in following regulations and maintaining order, but he was also smart enough to know that wars were won by people who could adapt to changing circumstances. When Sergeant Phillips called to tell him about the young woman who had outperformed his recruits, Morrison's first instinct was to tell him to send her to the Women's Corps and forget about the whole thing. But something in Phillips's voice made him pause. The sergeant was a good man and a good soldier, not the type to waste his commanding officer's time with foolishness. "Sir," Phillips had said, "I've been recruiting for 8 years. I've seen thousands of young men come through that office. This woman, she didn't just beat them. She made them look like children playing soldier." Morrison agreed to the meeting partly out of curiosity and partly because he had learned that unusual situations sometimes led to unusual opportunities. The military was facing challenges that traditional approaches weren't solving, and he was always looking for new ideas, even if they came from unexpected sources. Sarah arrived at Morrison's office precisely on time. wearing a simple blue dress and carrying herself with the kind of confident posture that came from years of hard work. Morrison had expected someone trying too hard to prove herself, someone aggressive and pushy. Instead, he found himself looking at a young woman who seemed remarkably calm and self-possessed. "Miss Mitchell," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Sergeant Phillips tells me you're interested in serving in combat roles." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I believe I can contribute to the war effort in ways that go beyond traditional women's roles." Morrison studied her for a moment. He had daughters of his own, and he understood the frustration that intelligent, capable women must feel in a world that limited their opportunities. But he also understood the reality of military life, the brutal physicality and psychological demands that broke even strong men. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. The military is not like civilian life. Combat is not like anything you've experienced, no matter how difficult your life has been. Mendi and Kumbath, they die screaming, calling for their mothers, bleeding out in mud and filth. The soldiers who survive have to live with images that haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is not a place for someone trying to prove a point about equality." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Sir, with respect, I'm not here to prove a point about equality. I'm here because my country is at war, and I have skills that could help win that war. I understand that combat is terrible. I understand that people die. I also understand that if we don't win this war, a lot more people are going to die than if we do win it." Morrison was impressed despite himself. Most recruits, male or female, came to his office with romantic notions about glory and heroism. This young woman seemed to understand that war was about effectiveness, not ideals. "All right," he said. "Let's say, hypothetically, that I was willing to consider your request. What exactly do you think you could contribute that our current soldiers cannot?" Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several letters. "These are recommendations from people I've worked with. The county sheriff will tell you that I've tracked down armed fugitives through terrain that his experienced deputies couldn't handle. The Forest Service supervisor will tell you that I've performed rescue operations in conditions that professional mountaineers considered too dangerous. The state police investigator will tell you that I've provided intelligence and assistance in cases involving organized crime." Morrison read through the letters, his eyebrows rising with each one. The picture they painted was of someone who had been doing dangerous, complex work for years, often in situations that required exactly the kind of skills the military valued most: the ability to operate independently, make quick decisions under pressure, and accomplish missions that others considered impossible. "This is impressive," he admitted, "but there's still the question of unit cohesion. Military effectiveness depends on soldiers being able to trust each other completely. That trust is built through shared experience and mutual respect. I'm concerned that introducing women into combat units could disrupt that dynamic." Sarah had been expecting this objection. "Sir, have you ever worked with someone who saved your life?" Morrison nodded. "Many times. Did you care what gender they were when they were pulling you out of danger?" The colonel was quiet for a moment. "You make a fair point, but policy isn't made based on individual cases. There are broader considerations. What if there was a way to test whether those broader considerations are valid?" Sarah asked. "What if there was a way to demonstrate that women can integrate into military units without disrupting effectiveness?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A trial program. A small unit, carefully selected, with a specific mission that plays to unconventional strengths. If the program fails, you can point to it as evidence that current policies are correct. If it succeeds, you have proof that the military is missing opportunities to utilize all available resources." Morrison was quiet for a long time, thinking. The war was not going well in the Pacific, and there were rumors of new types of operations being planned, missions that would require soldiers with unusual skills and exceptional independence. Traditional military training produced excellent soldiers for conventional warfare, but unconventional warfare required different approaches. "There is something," he said finally. "It's classified, and I can't give you details until I know whether you're even qualified to hear them. But There's a new program being developed, something that requires soldiers who can operate independently behind enemy lines. The selection process is intensive. Most men don't survive it. Those who do become part of something that doesn't officially exist. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What would I need to do to qualify for selection? Morrison smiled for the first time since she had entered his office. First, you would need to complete standard basic training. Not modified training, not special accommodation training. The same program that every male soldier completes with the same standards and the same requirements. If you can do that, then we'll discuss the next steps. When can I start? Are you sure you understand what you're asking for? Morrison asked. Basic training is designed to break people down and rebuild them. It's physically demanding in ways that go beyond anything you've experienced. Even if your body can handle it, there's the psychological pressure of being the only woman in a group of men who may not want you there. Sarah thought about the years of working alongside men who had initially resented her presence, the countless times she had had to prove herself over and over again before being accepted. I think I can handle it, she said. Morrison made a note in her file. There's a training company starting in 3 weeks at Fort Benning. I'll arrange for you to be included. But, Miss Mitchell, I want to be clear about something. If you fail, if you can't keep up, or if your presence causes problems for the other soldiers, you'll be transferred to the Women's Corps immediately. This is not a social experiment. This is a military necessity, and military necessities don't accommodate personal feelings or political positions. I understand, sir. Good. Report to Sergeant Phillips tomorrow morning. He'll arrange your transportation and provide you with the information you need. As Sarah left Morrison's office, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had gotten what she wanted, but she was beginning to understand that what she wanted might be more challenging than anything she had ever imagined. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah sold her belongings, said goodbye to her family, and tried to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. Her mother cried, her father tried to hide his worry, and her younger brother looked at her like she was the bravest person he had ever met. Promise me something, her father said the night before she left. Promise me you'll remember that being strong doesn't mean you have to do everything alone. The military is about teamwork. Don't let pride get in the way of asking for help when you need it. Sarah promised, though she wasn't sure she understood what he meant. She had always solved her problems through individual effort and determination. The idea of relying on others felt foreign and uncomfortable. Fort Benning was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The moment she stepped off the bus, she was surrounded by shouting sergeants, confused recruits, and an atmosphere of controlled chaos. She was assigned to a barracks with 47 young men, most of whom stared at her like she was some kind of exotic animal. Her drill sergeant, a weathered man named Thompson, pulled her aside on the first day. Mitchell, he said, I don't know what strings you pull to get here, but I want you to understand something. I don't care if you're a man, a woman, or a trained chimpanzee. My job is to turn civilians into soldiers, and that's what I'm going to do. If you can't keep up, you're gone. If you cause problems for the other recruits, you're gone. If you expect special treatment because of your gender, you're gone. Are we clear? Yes, Sergeant, Sarah replied. Good. Now drop and give me 20 push-ups for being late. Sarah hadn't been late, but she dropped and did the push-ups without complaint. She was beginning to understand that basic training wasn't about fairness or logic. It was about learning to follow orders instantly and without question, even when those orders didn't make sense. The physical challenges were intense, but manageable. Years of farm work had given Sarah a baseline of strength and endurance that served her well. She could keep up with the running, complete the obstacle courses, and handle the long marches with heavy packs. What was more difficult was the social isolation. Most of the other recruits were polite, but distant. They weren't hostile, but they also didn't seem to know how to relate to her. Conversations would stop when she approached, and she often found herself eating meals alone. A few of the men made crude comments, but they stopped quickly when they realized she wasn't going to be intimidated or offended. The real test came during the third week of training, during a field exercise that was designed to simulate combat conditions. The recruits were divided into squads and given a mission to capture a position held by experienced soldiers playing the role of enemy forces. The exercise would last 3 days and 2 nights, and success would require coordination, endurance, and tactical thinking. Sarah's squad was led by a recruit named Martinez, a college graduate who had shown natural leadership abilities. The other members included Thompson, the sandy-haired boy from the recruitment office; Jackson, a farm boy from Tennessee who reminded her of her brother; Williams, a city boy from Detroit who was smart but struggled with the physical demands; and Rodriguez, a quiet kid from Texas who seemed to understand tactics instinctively. On the first day of the exercise, everything went wrong. Their planned approach to the enemy position was spotted immediately, and they found themselves pinned down by simulated machine gun fire. Williams panicked and broke cover, which would have gotten him killed in real combat. Thompson twisted his ankle during a retreat that turned into a rout. By evening, they were exhausted, demoralized, and no closer to completing their mission. "We're not thinking about this right," Sarah said as they huddled in their makeshift camp that night. "We're approaching this like a conventional assault, but we're not a conventional unit. We're small, we're mobile, and we know this terrain better than they do now that we've spent a day moving around it." Martinez looked skeptical. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop trying to fight like we're a company of infantry and start fighting like we're a squad of scouts. We use stealth, we gather intelligence, we find weaknesses, and we exploit them." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "She's right. We've been trying to force our way through their defenses instead of finding ways around them." For the next hour, Sarah outlined a plan that drew on everything she had learned about tracking and hunting. Instead of approaching the enemy position directly, they would spend the next day mapping their patrol patterns and identifying gaps in their coverage. Instead of trying to overpower them, they would use misdirection and timing to achieve their objective. Martinez listened carefully, then looked around at the rest of the squad. "It's worth trying," he said. "What we've been doing isn't working." The next day, Sarah's plan worked perfectly. They gathered intelligence by observing the enemy position from concealed locations, identified the timing of patrol changes, and discovered an approach route that was only lightly guarded. That night, they infiltrated the position, completed their objective, and extracted without being detected. When they reported back to Sergeant Thompson, he studied their after-action report with surprise. "This is good work," he said finally. "Real good work. Mitchell, this plan has your fingerprints all over it." "It was a team effort, Sergeant," Sarah replied. Thompson nodded, but she could see in his expression that something had changed. For the first time, he was looking at her not as a problem to be managed, but as a soldier who had contributed to mission success. That night, as the squad celebrated their victory, Martinez pulled Sarah aside. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When I first saw you here, I thought you were going to be a distraction at best, a liability at worst. I was wrong." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at Fort Benning: acceptance. For the first time, she felt like she might actually belong here. What she didn't know was that their success in the field exercise had been noticed by people far above the level of drill sergeants and company commanders. Reports of her performance were making their way up through channels that led to offices she had never heard of, where decisions were made about programs that didn't officially exist. She was about to discover that conventional military training had been just the beginning of her journey, and that the real test of her abilities was yet to come. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in Sarah's final week of basic training. It was delivered by a courier she had never seen before, and it contained orders that didn't specify where she was going or what she would be doing there. All it said was to report to a certain address in Virginia at 0800 hours the following Monday, prepared for extended field operations. Sergeant Thompson was the one who explained what the letter meant, or at least what he was allowed to explain. "Mitchell," he said, calling her into his office after evening formation, "you've been selected for advanced training. I can't tell you what kind of training, where it's happening, or how long it will last. I can tell you that most people who get these orders don't come back the same as when they left. Is that good or bad, Sergeant? Sarah asked. Thompson was quiet for a moment, studying her face. That depends on what kind of person you are when you leave, he said finally. Some people come back stronger, smarter, more capable than they ever imagined they could be. Others come back broken. A few don't come back at all. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly are you trying to tell me, Sergeant? I'm telling you that you're about to volunteer for something that doesn't officially exist. I'm telling you that if you accept these orders, you're going to be pushed beyond what you think your limits are. I'm telling you that you still have a choice, right now, to say no and finish your military service in a nice, safe, conventional unit. Sarah looked at the letter in her hands. After everything she had been through to get this far, the idea of taking a safe, conventional path felt like giving up. What would you do, Sergeant? Thompson smiled. I'd go. But then again, I've always been too stubborn for my own good. Sarah reported to the address in Virginia on Monday morning, carrying a single duffel bag and wearing the standard utility uniform she had been issued at Fort Benning. The address led her to what looked like an ordinary office building in a quiet suburban area, but when she walked through the front door, she found herself in a reception area that felt more like a military facility than a civilian office. The receptionist, a young man in civilian clothes who carried himself like a soldier, checked her orders and directed her to an elevator that required a special key to operate. The elevator descended much further than she had expected, suggesting that the real facility was underground. When the doors opened, Sarah found herself in a hallway lined with offices and briefing rooms. The walls were covered with maps of places she didn't recognize, and she passed several rooms where men in military uniforms were studying photographs and documents that were immediately covered when she walked by. She was directed to a briefing room where 12 other soldiers were waiting. All of them were men, and all of them looked like they had been selected for their physical capabilities and mental toughness. Most were older than her, with the kind of weathered faces that came from years of military service. A few looked younger, but carried themselves with the confidence that came from exceptional training. The briefing officer was a major named Crawford, a thin man with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention without raising his voice. He looked at the assembled soldiers for a long moment before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, and Sarah noticed that he didn't pause or look uncomfortable when he said, "Ladies, you have been selected for a program that will test your abilities in ways that conventional military training cannot prepare you for. This program does not officially exist. The missions you may be asked to undertake do not officially exist. If you are killed or captured while participating in these missions, the United States government will officially have no knowledge of your activities." Crawford paused to let that information sink in. "You are here because analysis of your service records suggests that you possess unusual combinations of physical capability, mental toughness, and independent thinking. Over the next 6 months, you will be trained in advanced reconnaissance, unconventional warfare, and survival techniques that are not taught in any standard military curriculum." He gestured to a map behind him that showed regions of the Pacific Theater. "The war is entering a new phase. Traditional military operations are not sufficient to achieve the objectives that must be achieved. We need soldiers who can operate independently behind enemy lines for extended periods, who can gather intelligence that conventional methods cannot obtain, and who can complete missions that would be impossible for larger units." Sarah felt her heart racing. This was exactly what she had hoped for when she first walked into that recruitment office, but the reality of it was more serious and more dangerous than she had imagined. "The training you are about to undergo will be more difficult than anything you have experienced," Crawford continued. "Approximately 60% of candidates do not complete the program. Of those who do complete it, not all are selected for operational assignments. Those who are selected will undertake missions that carry a high probability of death or capture." He looked around the room again, making eye contact with each soldier. "Anyone who wishes to withdraw from consideration may do so now, with no negative consequences to their military record. You will be reassigned to conventional units, and Your participation in this briefing will be forgotten." Nobody moved. Sarah looked at the faces around her and saw the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that she was feeling. These were people who, like her, had volunteered for something that might be beyond their capabilities because they believed it was worth the risk. "Very well," Crawford said. "Transportation to the training facility will depart in 30 minutes. Gather your gear and report to the loading dock." The training facility was located in the mountains of North Carolina, in an area that maps showed as uninhabited wilderness. The bus ride took 6 hours through increasingly remote terrain, and when they finally arrived, Sarah found herself looking at a collection of buildings that seemed to be designed to blend into the forest around them. The commanding officer was Colonel Harrison, a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He had served in World War I, survived the Depression as a civilian, and returned to military service when the current war began. His introductory speech was brief and to the point. "For the next 6 months, you will learn to be ghosts," he said. "You will learn to move through enemy territory without being seen, to survive in hostile environments without support, and to complete missions that others consider impossible. You will learn to kill silently and efficiently when killing is necessary, and you will learn to gather information when information is more valuable than killing." He paused, studying the assembled candidates. "Most importantly, you will learn to rely on yourself and your teammates in situations where conventional military support does not exist. You will learn that Rangers don't rely on equipment or reinforcements or favorable odds. Rangers rely on training, intelligence, and each other." The training began immediately and was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. The days started before dawn with physical conditioning that went far beyond basic military fitness. They learned to run silently through dense forest, to climb vertical rock faces without equipment, and to swim underwater for distances that tested the limits of human endurance. But the physical training was only part of the program. They spent hours learning to read terrain and weather patterns, to navigate by natural landmarks, and to move across open ground without being detected. They studied foreign languages, enemy uniforms and equipment, and the cultural patterns that would help them blend into occupied territories. The weapons training was intensive and comprehensive. They learned to use not only American military equipment, but also captured enemy weapons and improvised tools. They practiced shooting under stress, in darkness, and while moving. They learned to set explosives to sabotage equipment and to kill silently with knives and bare hands. Sarah discovered that her background had prepared her for this training in ways that surprised her instructors. Her ability to read terrain came naturally, developed from years of tracking animals through difficult country. Her comfort with weapons and her steady hand under pressure had been developed through hunting in challenging conditions. Her physical toughness and endurance had been built through years of farm work. But she also discovered skills she hadn't known she possessed. She had an intuitive understanding of how to move silently through different types of terrain, almost as if she could sense the ground's reaction to her footsteps. She could remember complex route information after studying it only once, and she had a talent for noticing small details that others missed. The other candidates began to notice her abilities as well. Johnson, a career soldier from Texas, was the first to openly acknowledge what everyone was seeing. "Mitchell," he said after a particularly difficult navigation exercise, "I don't know how you do it, but you move through the woods like you were born there." Rodriguez, who had been in her basic training squad, nodded agreement. "It's like she can see things the rest of us miss. Tracks, signs, changes in the environment that tell her what's been through an area." The instructors were taking notice too. Captain Ellis, who taught the reconnaissance classes, started using Sarah as an example of proper technique. Sergeant Major Kowalski, the survival instructor, began pairing her with candidates who were struggling, using her skills to help bring them up to standard. But not everyone was pleased with her success. A candidate named Morrison, no relation to the colonel who had first approved her for training, made no secret of his resentment. He was a large man from Alabama who had enlisted expecting to be the most capable person in any group he joined. Sarah's presence challenged that expectation, and he didn't handle the challenge well. "This is bullshit," he complained to a group of other candidates after a particularly difficult week of exercises. "We're supposed to be elite soldiers, and they've got us taking lessons from Farm Girl. What happens when we're in real combat, and she can't keep up? What happens when she gets us all killed because she's trying to prove some point about women's equality?" Most of the other candidates ignored Morrison's complaints, but Sarah could sense the tension his attitude was creating. She had dealt with similar resentment before, but never in a situation where life and death might depend on unit cohesion. The test came during the 4th month of training, during an exercise designed to simulate operating behind enemy lines. The candidates were divided into 4-person teams and given missions that required them to infiltrate a defended area, gather specific intelligence, and extract without being detected. The exercise would last 1 week, and failure would result in immediate dismissal from the program. Sarah's team included Rodriguez, Johnson, and, unfortunately, Morrison. The mission was to penetrate a simulated enemy camp, photograph specific documents, and return with the intelligence within 72 hours. The camp was defended by instructors playing the role of enemy soldiers, using live ammunition loaded with marking rounds that would indicate kills without causing actual injury. The team spent the first day observing the enemy camp from concealed positions, mapping patrol patterns, and identifying vulnerabilities. Sarah quickly identified several opportunities for infiltration, but Morrison insisted on a more direct approach that relied on overpowering the guards rather than avoiding them. "We're Rangers," he said. "We don't skulk around like thieves. We complete our missions through superior firepower and aggression." Rodriguez looked skeptical. "The mission parameters specifically call for covert reconnaissance. We're supposed to get in and out without being detected." Morrison's face reddened. "Are you taking orders from her now? Since when do we plan our missions around what the farm girl thinks is best?" Johnson stepped in before the argument could escalate. "Let's try Sarah's approach first," he said quietly. "If it doesn't work, we can fall back to the direct assault option." That night, using the infiltration route Sarah had identified, the team successfully penetrated the enemy perimeter. They reached the target building without being detected, photographed the required documents, and were preparing to extract when Morrison made a decision that nearly got them all killed. Instead of following the planned extraction route, Morrison decided to prove his point by attacking a guard post that was not part of their mission. The attack succeeded, but it also alerted the entire camp to their presence. What should have been a clean covert operation turned into a running firefight that lasted the rest of the night. Johnson was hit by marking rounds during the chase and was officially killed in action. Rodriguez was wounded and had to be carried by Sarah and Morrison for the final 10 miles to the extraction point. They completed the mission, but barely, and only because Sarah's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to evade pursuit through areas that their pursuers couldn't follow. At the after-action briefing, Colonel Harrison was blunt in his assessment. "This mission should have been completed without a shot being fired," he said. "The intelligence was gathered successfully, but the execution was sloppy and resulted in unnecessary casualties." He looked directly at Morrison. "Ranger Morrison, your decision to engage targets that were not part of the mission objective violated direct orders and endangered your entire team. You are dismissed from the program." Morrison's face went white. "Sir, I was trying to complete the mission more effectively." "You were trying to prove a point," Harrison said coldly. "Rangers who put their personal agendas ahead of mission success don't survive long in combat, and they get their teammates killed. Pack your gear and report for reassignment." After Morrison was escorted away, Harrison turned to the rest of the team. The successful completion of this mission was due primarily to Ranger Mitchell's reconnaissance work and tactical planning. Her understanding of terrain and enemy behavior prevented this operation from becoming a complete disaster. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. She was glad that her abilities had been recognized, but she was sorry that proving herself had required someone else to fail so dramatically. The remaining 2 months of training passed quickly. Sarah completed every exercise successfully, often with scores that ranked her among the top candidates in the program. She learned to parachute from aircraft at night, to operate radios under combat conditions, and to coordinate with resistance fighters in occupied territories. By the end of the 6 months, only 7 of the original 13 candidates remained. Sarah was one of them, along with Rodriguez, Johnson, and for others who had demonstrated the exceptional abilities that the program required. At the graduation ceremony, Colonel Harrison addressed the survivors personally. "You are now qualified to undertake missions that the conventional military cannot complete," he said. "You will operate in small teams, often without support, in situations where failure is not acceptable. The skills you have learned here will keep you alive, but only if you remember the most important lesson. Rangers succeed not because they are individually superior, but because they understand that true strength comes from perfect teamwork and absolute trust." Sarah thought she understood what he meant, but she was about to discover that understanding something intellectually and living it under real combat conditions were very different things. She was about to be deployed on a mission that would test not only her individual skills, but her ability to work with people who might not want her there. She was also about to make a discovery that would challenge everything the military thought it knew about elite operations, a discovery that would ultimately lead to her being thrown out of the very program she had worked so hard to join. The mission briefing took place in a windowless room deep beneath the Pentagon, where maps of the Pacific Theater covered every wall, and the air smelled of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. Sarah sat with Rodriguez and Johnson, the 3 survivors who had been selected for what their commanding officers described as a critical intelligence operation. Major Crawford, who had briefed them at the beginning of their training, stood before a detailed map of the Philippine Islands. Red pins marked Japanese positions, blue pins marked known resistance groups, and black pins marked areas where previous reconnaissance missions had failed. "Gentlemen and lady," Crawford began, "the situation in the Philippines is more complex than our public statements suggest. While General MacArthur has promised to return, the reality is that we have limited intelligence about current Japanese defensive positions and almost no reliable communication with resistance fighters in the interior." He pointed to a cluster of islands in the southern Philippines. "Your mission is to infiltrate this area, make contact with resistance groups, gather intelligence on Japanese troop movements and defensive preparations, and establish communication networks that can support future operations. The mission duration is estimated at 90 days, though you should be prepared for longer." Crawford's expression became more serious. "Previous attempts to establish intelligence networks in this area have failed. 2 teams have been inserted over the past 6 months. Neither has been heard from again. We don't know if they were killed, captured, or simply unable to establish communications." Rodriguez raised his hand. "Sir, what assets will we have for extraction?" "None guaranteed," Crawford replied bluntly. "You'll be inserted by submarine at night, approximately 2 miles offshore from your target landing point. From that point, you'll be operating independently until you can establish radio contact with our assets in Australia. Even then, extraction will depend on operational requirements and available resources." Sarah studied the map, noting the terrain features and the distances involved. The mission area was heavily forested and mountainous, with numerous small villages and limited transportation infrastructure. It was ideal country for guerrilla operations, but it was also ideal for getting lost or cut off from support. "What's our cover story if we're captured?" Johnson asked. Crawford was quiet for a moment. "There is no cover story. If you're captured, the United States government has no knowledge of your existence. You'll be treated as spies, and you can expect execution if you're taken alive." The weight of that statement settled over the room. Sarah had known that this mission would be dangerous, but the reality of operating without any official support was sobering in a way that training exercises couldn't duplicate. "Your insertion is scheduled for tomorrow night," Crawford continued. "You have 18 hours to study the intelligence files, memorize your target objectives, and prepare your equipment. Any questions?" There were no questions, but Sarah could see in her teammates' faces the same mixture of excitement and apprehension that she was feeling. They had trained for this kind of mission, but training and reality were different things. The submarine that carried them toward the Philippines was cramped, noisy, and uncomfortable. Sarah spent the 3-day journey studying maps and intelligence reports, learning the names of villages, the locations of Japanese garrisons, and the tribal affiliations that might determine whether resistance fighters would help them or turn them in. The insertion went smoothly. They transferred to a small inflatable boat in the darkness before dawn, paddled silently to shore, and dragged their boat into the jungle before the sun rose. By the time the sun was fully up, they had established their first camp 3 miles inland, hidden in dense forest that would conceal them from aerial observation. The first week went according to plan. They moved carefully through the jungle, avoiding Japanese patrols and establishing contact with local villagers who might have information about resistance groups. Sarah's ability to move silently through difficult terrain proved invaluable, allowing the team to gather intelligence without being detected. It was Sarah who first spotted the signs that previous American teams had been in the area. She found remains of campsites that had been carefully concealed, equipment caches that had been abandoned, and, most ominously, graves that had been hastily dug and marked with improvised crosses. "These aren't Filipino graves," she told Rodriguez and Johnson as they examined the burial sites. "The way the bodies are positioned, the types of personal effects that were buried with them, these are American soldiers." Rodriguez studied the graves with a grim expression. "So we know what happened to the previous teams." Johnson was examining the abandoned equipment. "Some of this gear is recent. The team might have been operating in this area just weeks ago." The discovery changed the nature of their mission. Instead of simply gathering intelligence, they were now operating in an area where American teams had been systematically hunted down and eliminated. The question was whether they had been betrayed by local collaborators or simply outmaneuvered by Japanese forces. The answer came during their second week, when Sarah's reconnaissance skills saved their lives. She had been scouting a village that was supposed to be friendly to American interests when she noticed something that didn't fit the pattern of normal village life. "There are too many young men," she told Rodriguez and Johnson when she returned to their camp. "In every other village we've observed, the young men are either gone, presumably conscripted or fled to the mountains, or they're obviously trying to avoid Japanese attention. In this village, there are young men moving around openly, and they're too well-fed and too well-armed to be ordinary farmers." Rodriguez frowned. "You think they're collaborators?" "I think they're Japanese soldiers in civilian clothes," Sarah replied. "The way they move, the way they position themselves around the village, the way they watch the approaches, it's too organized to be coincidence." Johnson studied the map. "If you're right, then this village has been turned into a trap. Previous American teams might have walked into the same setup." Sarah nodded. "The question is whether we try to avoid this village entirely or whether we try to gather intelligence about how many other villages might be compromised." The decision to investigate further nearly cost them everything. Using a combination of careful observation and limited infiltration, they discovered that the Japanese had indeed established a network of fake villages designed to lure American reconnaissance teams into traps. The villages looked normal from a distance, but closer examination revealed that they were garrisoned by specially trained soldiers whose job was to capture or kill American agents. The intelligence was valuable, but obtaining it had required them to get close to enemy positions in ways that increased their risk of discovery. On their 15th night in the field, their luck ran out. Sarah was on watch when she heard the sounds that meant their position had been discovered. It wasn't the normal noise of the jungle at night, but the subtle sounds of people trying to move quietly through undergrowth. She woke Rodriguez and Johnson silently, and they began the emergency procedures they had practiced dozens of times during training. The attack came at dawn, coordinated and professional. Japanese soldiers approached from 3 directions simultaneously, using tactics that suggested they had been tracking the American team for days. The ensuing firefight was brief, but intense and it became clear within minutes that the Americans were outnumbered and outpositioned. "We need to break contact and reach the fallback position," Rodriguez whispered during a brief lull in the firing. But Sarah had been studying the terrain and the enemy positions, and she could see something that her teammates couldn't. "We can't outrun them through this terrain," she said. "They know the area better than we do, and they positioned themselves to cut off our escape routes." Johnson looked frustrated. "So what do you suggest?" Sarah had been thinking about the problem differently than her teammates, drawing on her experience as a hunter rather than as a soldier. "We don't run from them," she said. "We make them run from us." What she proposed was not conventional military tactics, but it was based on an understanding of psychology and terrain that went beyond standard training. Instead of trying to escape from a superior force, they would use the jungle itself as a weapon, turning the enemy's knowledge of the area into a disadvantage. Over the next 6 hours, Sarah led her teammates in a campaign of harassment that was part guerrilla warfare and part hunting strategy. They used their knowledge of explosives to create confusion and misdirection, their marksmanship skills to eliminate isolated enemies, and, most importantly, their understanding of jungle warfare to stay one step ahead of pursuit. The key insight came from Sarah's observation that the Japanese soldiers, while well-trained and familiar with the area, were thinking like conventional military forces. They were trying to corner and capture the Americans using tactics that would work against other soldiers, but they were less effective against people who understood how to use the environment as an ally rather than simply as terrain to be crossed. By the end of the day, the Japanese patrol had been reduced to half its original size and was withdrawing toward their base, carrying their wounded and apparently having given up the pursuit. Sarah's team had suffered minor injuries, but remained combat effective and in possession of intelligence that would prove valuable to future operations. "That was unlike anything they taught us in training," Johnson said as they finally reached their fallback position. Rodriguez nodded. "I've never seen anyone use terrain the way you just did. It was like you could predict where they were going to be before they got there." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about what had just happened. She had relied on instincts and insights that went beyond her military training, drawing on skills that had been developed through years of hunting and tracking in difficult country. But she had also realized something that would have implications far beyond their current mission. "I don't think conventional military training prepares people for this kind of warfare," she said finally. "The tactics we use today, the way we moved through the jungle, the way we anticipated enemy movements, none of that came from our ranger training. It came from understanding how to think like a predator instead of thinking like a soldier." Johnson looked puzzled. "What's the difference?" "Soldiers are trained to control territory, to hold positions, to advance against objectives," Sarah explained. "But this kind of mission requires thinking like something that lives in the environment rather than something that's trying to conquer it. It requires understanding that sometimes the best way to win is not to fight the way your enemy expects you to fight." Rodriguez was studying the map, thinking about their next moves. "You're talking about something that goes beyond tactics or training. You're talking about a completely different approach to warfare." Sarah nodded. "And I think it's an approach that could change how we think about special operations. Instead of training elite soldiers to be better at conventional warfare, we should be training them to be better at unconventional warfare. We should be teaching them to think like hunters, like predators, like people who belong in these environments rather than people who are temporarily visiting them." What Sarah was articulating was the beginning of an insight that would revolutionize how military forces around the world thought about elite operations. But it was also an insight that would put her in conflict with military leaders who believe that conventional approaches to training and tactics were the foundation of military effectiveness. Over the remaining weeks of their mission, Sarah continued to develop and test her theories about unconventional warfare. The team successfully established contact with genuine resistance fighters, gathered extensive intelligence about Japanese defensive positions, and created communication networks that would support future operations. But more importantly, Sarah documented the tactics and techniques they had developed, creating a manual that described how small teams could operate effectively in hostile environments by thinking like hunters rather than soldiers. Her notes described how to use terrain as a weapon, how to anticipate enemy movements by understanding their psychological patterns, and how to achieve mission objectives through misdirection and environmental manipulation rather than superior firepower. When they were finally extracted after 93 days in the field, Sarah's team had accomplished everything their mission required and more. They had proven that American forces could operate effectively behind Japanese lines, established intelligence networks that would support MacArthur's eventual return to the Philippines, and developed new approaches to special operations that would influence military thinking for decades. But Sarah had also created something that would make her enemies among people who believed that military innovation was dangerous and that conventional approaches to warfare should not be questioned. She was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who wear the same uniform you do. The after-action reports from her mission would reach offices where decisions were made about the future of special operations programs. Some of those reports would praise her innovation and effectiveness. Others would question whether someone who operated so far outside conventional military doctrine could be trusted to follow orders in future operations. Sarah was about to learn that being right about something important could be more dangerous than being wrong about something trivial, and that the military bureaucracy was often more threatened by innovation than inspired by it. The debriefing took place over 3 weeks at a classified facility in California, where intelligence officers, tactical analysts, and senior commanders studied every detail of Sarah's mission in the Philippines. Her team's success had exceeded all expectations, and the intelligence they had gathered was already being used to plan future operations throughout the Pacific theater. But Sarah began to sense that something was wrong during the second week of debriefing sessions. While her tactical innovations were being studied with great interest, she noticed that certain officers seemed more concerned with her methods than with her results. General Patterson, a career infantry officer who had risen through conventional channels, was particularly skeptical during the sessions where Sarah presented her theories about unconventional warfare. He listened politely as she described how small teams could operate more effectively by thinking like hunters rather than soldiers. But his questions revealed a deep discomfort with approaches that deviated from established military doctrine. "Miss Mitchell," he said during one session, "your results in the field are impressive, but I'm concerned about the implications of the methods you're advocating. Military effectiveness depends on discipline, structure, and adherence to proven tactical principles. What you're describing sounds more like improvisation." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Sir, with respect, I believe that unconventional warfare requires unconventional approaches. The enemy we're fighting doesn't follow our tactical manuals, and if we limit ourselves to conventional responses, we'll be at a disadvantage." Patterson's expression suggested that he viewed this as precisely the kind of thinking that concerned him. "The problem with improvisation, Miss Mitchell, is that it's difficult to teach, difficult to standardize, and difficult to control. How do we train other soldiers to replicate what you accomplished if your methods can't be reduced to standard procedures?" It was a fair question, but Sarah could see that Patterson was more interested in finding problems with her approach than in finding ways to implement it. She had encountered this kind of thinking before, in people who believed that anything that couldn't be easily systematized was inherently dangerous. Colonel Harrison, who had overseen her Ranger training, was more supportive but equally concerned about different aspects of her innovations. "Sarah," he said during a private conversation, "what you accomplished in the Philippines was remarkable, but I'm worried that you're developing approaches that rely too heavily on individual capabilities rather than team coordination." Sarah was surprised by this criticism. "Sir, everything we accomplished was the result of teamwork. Rodriguez and Johnson were essential to our success." Harrison nodded. "But the tactical innovations, the environmental awareness, the ability to predict enemy movements, those capabilities seem to be uniquely yours. What happens when we try to implement these approaches with teams that don't include someone with your background and instincts?" It was a question that Sarah had been thinking about herself. Her success in the Philippines had indeed relied heavily on skills that had been developed through years of hunting and tracking, experiences that most soldiers didn't have. But she believed that these skills could be taught to others, given the right training programs and sufficient time. I think we could develop training programs that teach these skills, she said. It would require a different approach than conventional military training, more time spent in natural environments, more emphasis on observation and environmental awareness, but it could be done. Harrison looked skeptical. That kind of training would take years to implement and would require resources that we don't have in the middle of a war. More importantly, it would require convincing senior leadership that our current approaches to training elite forces are insufficient. Sarah was beginning to understand the real problem. Her innovations weren't being rejected because they didn't work. They were being rejected because implementing them would require acknowledging that current training methods were inadequate and would require substantial changes to established programs. The political dimensions of the situation became clear during her final debriefing session, when she was asked to present her recommendations for future special operations training. She had prepared a comprehensive report that outlined how military forces could develop the kind of environmental awareness and unconventional tactical thinking that had made her team successful in the Philippines. General Patterson listened to her presentation with growing impatience, finally interrupting before she could finish. "Miss Mitchell, what you're proposing would essentially require us to rebuild our entire approach to special operations training. You're suggesting that everything we currently teach Rangers and other elite forces is inadequate." Sarah tried to clarify her position. "Not inadequate, sir. Just incomplete. Current training programs are excellent for conventional warfare, but they don't prepare soldiers for the kind of unconventional operations that are becoming increasingly important in this war. And you believe that you, with less than 2 years of military experience, have discovered deficiencies that have escaped the attention of officers with decades of experience?" Patterson's tone made it clear that he viewed this as professional arrogance rather than legitimate innovation. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed, not because her ideas were wrong, but because of who she was. "Sir, I believe that sometimes fresh perspectives can identify opportunities that experience might overlook. I'm not suggesting that experienced officers are incompetent. I'm suggesting that unconventional problems might require unconventional solutions." But she could see in Patterson's face that the conversation was over. He had made up his mind about her and her ideas, and nothing she said was going to change his opinion. The formal recommendation that ended her military career came 3 days later, delivered by Colonel Morrison, the officer who had first approved her for military service. He looked uncomfortable as he read from the official document. "Based on evaluation of your performance during recent operations and analysis of your approach to military procedures, it has been determined that your methods, while effective in specific circumstances, are not suitable for broader implementation within existing military structures." Morrison paused, looking up from the document. "Sarah, what this means is that you're being reassigned to conventional duties. Your insights and innovations will be studied and evaluated, but you won't be participating in further special operations." Sarah felt like she had been hit in the stomach. "Sir, are you telling me that I'm being punished for succeeding?" Morrison's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I'm telling you that your success created complications that senior leadership believes are not in the best interests of the overall program. Your individual capabilities are exceptional, but military effectiveness requires approaches that can be standardized and replicated across large numbers of personnel. So my ideas will be studied, but I won't be allowed to participate in implementing them." Morrison nodded reluctantly. "That's correct. You'll be reassigned to a training position where you can contribute to conventional military education, but your involvement in special operations is over." Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, trying to process what she was being told. After everything she had accomplished, after proving that her approaches could achieve results that conventional methods couldn't, she was being removed from the very program she had helped to improve. "There's something else," Morrison said quietly. "This reassignment comes with certain conditions. The work you did in the Philippines the innovations you developed, the intelligence you gathered, all of that is classified at the highest levels. You're not permitted to discuss any of it with anyone who doesn't have appropriate clearances. Sarah understood what he was really telling her. Not only was she being removed from special operations, but she was being silenced about the reasons why her removal was unjustified. The irony of her situation became clear over the following months, as she was assigned to teach conventional warfare tactics to new recruits. She watched young soldiers learning approaches to combat that she knew were inadequate for the challenges they would face in the field, but she was forbidden from sharing the knowledge that might help them survive. Meanwhile, she began to hear rumors about new special operations programs that were being developed using principles that sounded suspiciously similar to the one she had advocated. The programs were being implemented slowly and carefully with extensive testing and evaluation, exactly the kind of systematic approach that military bureaucracy preferred. The soldiers being trained in these programs were achieving remarkable success in operations throughout the Pacific theater. They were operating behind enemy lines with the kind of effectiveness that had previously been impossible, using tactics that emphasized environmental awareness and unconventional thinking rather than conventional military approaches. But Sarah's role in developing these innovations was being systematically erased from official records. The after-action reports from her mission in the Philippines were reclassified and restricted to a small number of senior officers. Her recommendations for training reforms were attributed to anonymous sources or credited to officers who had never participated in unconventional operations. Rodriguez and Johnson, who had served with her in the Philippines and witnessed her innovations firsthand, were reassigned to different units and discouraged from discussing their experiences. The official history of special operations development would make no mention of the farm girl from Illinois who had revolutionized how elite forces thought about unconventional warfare. A year after her reassignment, Sarah learned through informal channels that the training programs she had recommended were being implemented at facilities across the country. Rangers and other special forces were being taught to think like hunters, to use terrain as a weapon, and to operate in hostile environments using approaches that emphasized environmental awareness over conventional tactics. The programs were achieving exactly the kind of success that Sarah had predicted, with special operations forces accomplishing missions that had previously been considered impossible. American teams were operating effectively behind enemy lines throughout the Pacific, using tactics that confused and demoralized enemy forces who had been trained to counter conventional military approaches. But the soldiers being trained in these programs had no idea that their training methods had been developed by a woman who had been thrown out of the military for being too innovative. They were learning from instructors who had learned from other instructors, in a chain of knowledge that deliberately obscured its original source. Sarah's discovery that Rangers don't rely on parachutes, that they rely on intelligence, environmental awareness, and unconventional thinking, had become the foundation of modern special operations training. But she would never receive credit for that discovery, and her role in revolutionizing military tactics would remain classified for decades. The final irony came near the end of the war, when Sarah received a letter from a former student who had gone on to serve in special operations. The soldier, who had no idea of her connection to his training, wrote to thank her for the conventional warfare instruction she had provided during his basic training. "The tactics you taught us saved our lives more than once," he wrote. "But I have to tell you, the most valuable things we learned came from special programs that taught us to think differently about warfare. We learned to use the environment as an ally, to anticipate enemy movements through observation and analysis, and to accomplish missions through intelligence rather than firepower. I wish I could tell you more about it, but it's all classified." Sarah kept that letter for the rest of her life, a reminder of how her innovations had helped win the war, even though her contribution would never be officially recognized. She had proven that sometimes being thrown out of an institution was the price of changing it for the better. After the war, Sarah returned to farming, using the skills she had learned in the military to improve agricultural techniques and help other veterans transition to civilian life. She never spoke publicly about her military service, partly because of classification restrictions, but mostly because she had learned that some contributions were more important than the credit that came with them. The training programs she had developed continued to evolve and improve, becoming the foundation for special operations forces around the world. The insight that elite soldiers should think like hunters rather than conventional warriors became accepted doctrine, though its origins remained hidden in classified files. Sarah's story became a legend whispered among special operations veterans, a tale of the mysterious woman who had revolutionized unconventional warfare and then disappeared from official records. Some claimed she had never existed, that she was a composite character created to represent multiple innovations by different people. But those who knew the truth understood that Sarah Mitchell had accomplished something more important than personal recognition. She had proven that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that the most important discoveries are often made by people who are told they don't belong, and that sometimes being thrown out of an institution is exactly what it takes to find a better way. Her legacy lived on in every special operations mission that relied on environmental awareness rather than conventional tactics, in every soldier who learned to think like a hunter rather than a warrior, and in every successful operation that proved that Rangers don't rely on parachutes. They rely on the intelligence, innovation, and unconventional thinking that Sarah Mitchell had pioneered in the jungles of the Philippines.